My guest at the interview bar tonight is the F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow in Law and Economics at the American Enterprise Institute. He's written a variety of things, including a book called The Real Jimmy Carter and 3 books with Reagan in the title. His newest book is The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Presidents, From Wilson to Obama. He ordered a gin and tonic. Please welcome Steven Hayward. Steven, welcome.
Cheers, Brian.
Cheers. Nostrovia, as they say. First of all, Politically Incorrect Guide. Strong gin and tonic.
Well, good.
Politically Incorrect Guide to the Presidents from Wilson to Obama. Why are you starting with Wilson?
Wilson's the guy who changes the presidency fundamentally. Okay. And plus, I thought a lot of people wouldn't be that interested in reading about John Tyler or William Henry Harrison.
Right. Why does he always come up?
Right. I mean, things really get interesting, maybe with Teddy Roosevelt, but especially Wilson. He changes the presidency in fundamental ways. He's also the first president to attack the Constitution and say it was actually obsolete for our times.
Which I presume he took an oath when he was being sworn in to uphold the Constitution. Did he not, or did he kind of weasel out of that?
No, he's the guy, if it had been up to Wilson, he would have thrown the Constitution out and written a new one. He actually, by the way, wrote a constitution for his marriage with his wife, so he must have been a fun guy to be around.
Sounds loving.
Yeah, absolutely. But you can't get rid of our Constitution. So he said, let's just reinterpret it the way we want. He gave us the idea of the living Constitution, which liberals love and embrace now, which I say the living Constitution means the written Constitution is dead. You
go throughout the book and you give them a constitutional rating of
right.
how they handle the Constitution, and Wilson gets, I presume,
an F.
An F. Why?
This is sort of like your citizenship grades people my age got back in school, which really meant did you behave in class,
right? Separate
from math and literature. I had 3 criteria. Did they share the founders' understanding of the Constitution, or did they reject it like Wilson did? Second, did they do things to undermine the constitutional restraints on centralized power in Washington? And then third, I also held them accountable for their Supreme Court appointments. Okay. So, you know, a lot of presidents, including a lot of Republican presidents, have put very liberal people on the court who then expanded government power even more.
What are other ways in which our presidents are different now than they were 150 years ago?
The biggest one that most people would be familiar with is we now place a premium on charisma. You know, both Roosevelts were charismatic, but especially John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, and Barack Obama. That would have appalled the founding fathers. You know, George Washington, a modest man in a lot of ways, James Madison, they would have been horrified to think that we were going to transform the presidency into a high school student body president election. But it's become that to a large extent.
TV kind of seems to be responsible for that in some ways.
TV's part of it, but again, Wilson starts something we're very familiar with. Wilson's the first president to give the State of the Union speech in front of Congress, the way we do it now. That's long before TV. Before that, most presidents just sent a letter, because the Constitution says the president shall provide information on the State of the Union. So most of them sent letters. He wanted to make it this spectacle in front of Congress, and then when television came along, it's only made it worse.
So he turned it into a showcase. Who gets the best rating? Who's the best constitutional president?
Calvin Coolidge.
Okay.
Silent Cal, they called him. He wasn't silent at all. He gave a lot of very thoughtful speeches about the Constitution, which he wrote himself, by the way, the last president to write his own speeches. I gave him an A+ because he was the most constitutionally literate president of the last 100 years. By the way, a funny guy.
Calvin Coolidge?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorites is some cranky person walked up to him on the street one day and said, I didn't vote for you. And Coolidge just said, well, somebody did. It's good.
Okay. Also noticed that Jimmy Carter, I guess you wrote a book on Jimmy Carter, so you know a lot about him. You said that this whole ridiculous dragged-out campaign process is his fault. How so?
He's the guy who discovered the Iowa caucuses.
Okay.
Before Jimmy Carter, no one paid attention to the Iowa caucuses, and things started in New Hampshire, usually in late February or March. He discovered that if you won the Iowa caucus and then spun it in the press, you could get a leg up on everybody. And so now that's why the calendars have moved up and why Iowa is suddenly very important in every campaign. By the way, you know, all presidents are a little weird. These are unusual people, but he's by far the weirdest of all our modern presidents. He's the only president who has ever filed a UFO sighting report with the Air Force. To pick one.
What did he get for his constitutional score?
I gave him an F.
F?
Yeah.
Harry Truman got a C+.
Right.
Why?
Well, you know, he was actually a very good president overall. I'm a fan of Truman's in a lot of ways. But on my 3 criteria of his defense of the Constitution, he was rather weak. He appointed liberals to the Supreme Court, tried to seize the steel industry on his own executive authority, and got swatted down by a very liberal court. So that's why he fell short on my metrics, even though overall I think he was an excellent president.
My father saw Harry Truman in his underwear and said he wore sock garters. He was on a security detail.
I'm not going to, oh, okay. I was not going to ask how.
It was, I should probably elaborate. Yeah, he was on a, he was at a college, and my father was a policeman and was working in a security detail for the college. And Harry Truman was apparently very friendly, invited him up, his wife was there, and just proceeded to take off his pants as he was chatting away and you know, talking to his wife and my father.
Yeah.
Barack Obama's grade currently an F. You had a little asterisk because, of course, his term's not finished.
Well, he's not finished, and if you know, I do teach at the college level some, and if he were a student who came to me and said, "What can I do? Shouldn't I have an incomplete?" I would say, "There's no hope you're going to raise your grade. You should drop the class."
He's got a pretty bad track record. I mean, if you follow, I mean, you know, habeas corpus and things like that, and all these other transgressions that are occurring under his administration.
Well, I think he thinks the Constitution is optional.
Well, it's strange because he was a constitutional scholar.
Yes and no. The reason I say that is if you actually look at the courses he taught the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. That's essentially all. And that's the liberals' favorite.
Okay.
That's the one that says equal protection for everything, and the courts for a couple of decades under liberals have used that as a hunting license to do justice wherever they felt like it. That's what he taught. He didn't teach about the separation of powers. He never taught about Article 2, about the presidency. He skipped over all the institutional things that are embedded in the Constitution, and he really has no theory of individual rights that you'd recognize. So that's why it's way overstated that he's a constitutional scholar.
Well, why does George Bush, W. Bush, gets a B+ in your book?
Right.
Why is that? Because he strikes me as somebody who kind of, you know, stepped on the Constitution a little bit, especially the Fourth Amendment, Patriot Act, things like that happening under.
Yeah, those are maybe it's grade inflation. Maybe I had you know, had too many of these when I wrote that chapter. Those are good criticisms of him. He does well on my metrics because his 2 Supreme Court picks, I think, are quite good. He's the first Republican president in maybe forever who hasn't botched one of his Supreme Court appointments. You know, his dad botched one with David Souter. I actually think most of his defenses of executive power are constitutionally legitimate. And the problem with the Fourth Amendment, there's a reason. You're referring, of course, to the famous clause that says bans unreasonable search and seizure.
Right.
Well, there's this problem. What does unreasonable mean?
Yeah.
Well, we've been trying to work that out since the founding, and that's why there are more cases on that one word than any other clause of the Constitution, and always will be. So I think that's arguable, although I think many of the criticisms of him are legitimate, and I share some of them. But he came out well on my scorecard, which maybe means my scorecard could be refined a bit. But
who's the worst one?
Oh, Wilson and Obama are bookends. Franklin Roosevelt comes out pretty poorly. He gets an F also. They're the 3 leading ones. But Wilson and Obama really are bookends. They really are very much alike. And so one of the reasons I did the book now and the way I did it is we're now at the end of a 100-year cycle. My hope is that the 2012 election will be the repeal of the 1912 election that brought us Wilson. That may be optimistic, but that's my hope.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Stephen.
Well, thanks for having me, Brian.
Cheers.
Cheers.
All right. That concludes this week's BS of A with your host, me. My guest was Steven Hayward, author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Presidents. New BS of A next week. Until then, you can look us up on Facebook and Twitter, and we're putting a lot of money into a MySpace page. We'll see you next week, and please, if there's only one thing that you take away from tonight's episode, it's this. 1 parking spot per car until America's back on her feet. I'm Brian Sack. Good night.
Well, that's good.
Rolling some credits now.